We started, when I arranged the program, I said we would be talking about America as America, and in the afternoon, America and the world. But it's impossible to remove the world from America or America from the world. So let's say we're just continuing in that vein, but with a different, slightly different focus. We turn this afternoon to the America and the world in this era of our radically increased connectedness and interdependence. And given the prominence of the American role in the politics of the world over the last century, we need to get a better sense of where we stand as a nation, as a player in world politics, and what our best and worst case scenarios are for the future. Our two lecturers have given serious thought to these matters from their quite different perspectives. David Grewal, our first lecturer this afternoon, we hope that he will help us to understand globalization and how it changes the stakes in dealing with some of our most critical struggles. Globalization has become a household word. It seems that it is an entirely new phenomenon, but that is hardly the case. It is most often identified with economics, citing the global economy, but it goes way beyond economics. It is a subject laden with misconceptions, and it is ever more important to discover its strengths and weaknesses and its political and cultural implications, as well as its economic ones. And so we were indeed fortunate to have with us David Grewal, the author of Network Power, The Social Dynamics of Globalization, which is, according to Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel, one of the most original and insightful books on globalization. Dr. Grewal is associate professor at the Yale Law School and a former member of the Society of Fellows at Harvard. He's one of the leading interpreters of globalization in our time and will offer us as much food for thought on the implications of globalization as on our American way of life. Please join me in welcoming him.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay? Is this in the back of the room? Super. Well, first, greetings, and thank you very much to Sandra and Maury. It's a pleasure to meet you both at last, and also to the University of Scranton and to the Schemel Forum for having me. Thanks as well to Akil and Joe, although I think thanks a lot in Joe's way is also even more warranted now that I have two excellent speakers to follow rather than just one. And I'm also at a disadvantage compared to the first two speakers because while they're masters of known texts, I'm not a master, and what I'm dealing with is not a text, but a context that's evolving and whose outlines and shape are very unclear. The last Roth novel remains to be written, and so too the Constitution, and so too globalization. So with that, I wanted to also note that it's after lunch. I'm sleepy, you're sleepy. So we're going to have to make this a little bit more participatory than might have been the case in the morning. And so I may need to draw on your collective wisdom to help me illuminate some puzzles at different points. And I hope that you'll shout out answers when I pose questions. So the talk will proceed in three parts. In the first bit, I'm going to try and give an account of what globalization is. Globalization is a portmanteau term that captures all kinds of cross-border activity, like Sandra said, economic, sociocultural, political. But one of the things I advanced in my book, Network Power, is a particular account of what we might mean when we talk about globalization. And I'm going to try that out and see what you think about it. I'm then going to turn to some criticisms that have been made of globalization. I'm going to focus on them as a way of getting us to think about what might be wrong with it and also what might be right with it if it were differently configured. And then finally, I'm going to think about what we might do about it, or which links to the question of how it will evolve. And then I'd like to pause and leave a lot of room for discussion, because this is something that is very new and people have a lot of interesting ideas on it. I'd love to hear yours too. So, if we turn to the question what globalization is, we should note that first we see a huge amount of popular discussion of it. You can't pick up the newspapers these days without coming across the term. And if we turn to the more academic literature, I found often quite unsatisfying responses. The phenomenon in general is described as something like the interconnection, often the increasing interconnection of activities outside or across national borders. So far, so good. And also, usually there's something about an increasing awareness of the fact that activities across borders are increasing. So it's not just an objective phenomenon, but it's something that we're aware of and that affects our understanding of ourselves. But this idea, which I think is not wrong, is a description and doesn't really give us a good understanding of how the process works. So to get to that issue, sorry, I'm just trying to turn this on again. To get to that issue, I wanted to throw out a question. So suppose you were looking for the Brennan building on campus today and you didn't know where it was, as I didn't when I came here, and you were planning on meeting up with someone. And you didn't have their cell phone number, or you'd lost your cell phone or forgot to charge it, would there be a place on campus, this is something as an outsider I don't know, but is there a place on campus where you'd go hoping to meet your lost friend? No? Campus Green? And what about in Scranton downtown? If you got separated, you didn't know which restaurant you were supposed to meet someone at this evening, is there a place you'd go in the Scranton downtown where you would think you'd meet them? You're both lost, you know each other's lost, you can't call each other. Is there a place you'd go to try and meet them there without having arranged it in advance? Yeah, you have an idea.
Cornell Square.
Cornell Square? Who else would have said Cornell Square? Courthouse Square. Courthouse Square. Not Nithka. No, it's not. And there's that statue in Courthouse Square, right, of the labor leader. Yeah. Yeah, Robert Mitchell. Yeah, so I went and looked at the square earlier today. I cheated because I thought I needed to try and figure out where that might be, and so I went for the central place and I looked for a prominent landscape. Now, so what I'm getting at in all this is an adaptation of an example that people have posed about Manhattan. And there was a famous Nobel Prize-winning economist named Thomas Schelling who asked what he called an unscientific sample of respondents where they would meet a lost friend without having arranged any way in advance to meet them if they were in Manhattan. Does anybody have a view on where they'd meet someone if they're stuck in Manhattan? Grand Central Station. So there's a couple here. So we've got Grand Central Station, we've got Times Square. Times Square, you're going to get lost with all the tourists. That's no good. Okay. Top of the Empire State Building. So what we're getting at here, what Thomas Schelling called focal points. These are points or conventions about, in his case, where you'd meet someone, a lost friend. And what we find when we ask people, and Thomas Schelling's unscientific sample, in that sample, a large majority of his people said Grand Central Station, the clock tower in the middle of it, and almost all of them, nearly all of them said, and when he asked the second question, at what time would you meet them? 12 noon. Lost during the day. And none of them had arranged that in advance. So I thought a lot about this example, and I was thinking about it in the context of globalization, where I think we're asking not where to meet a lost friend, but how to meet people we don't know. And I asked a group of people from the Indian Institute of Technology, which is a very elite Indian institute that draws from all over India, if they were going to an international conference. I didn't specify where it was, what language they would assume they'd be speaking at the conference. English, right, comes up, and they all said that. And then I asked the further question, what if you knew that it was being held in a non-English speaking country, but that the other invitees had multinational citizenships among them? And again, people said English. So even an international conference being held in China or in the Middle East, the assumption was when you got there that English would be the language spoken. So what's going on? I think that there's a link between Thomas Schelling's argument about how people coordinate their activities in the absence of any prior discussion and something about what's going on in globalization, which is that we're having coordination on a global level through shared focal points. So like the Grand Central Station idea, but it's not where we're meeting, it's how we're meeting. And how we meet is by using certain standards. And standards are, we can think of languages, rules, systems of regulation, measurement systems like the metric or the imperial system, you name it, sometimes customs, and other kinds of conventions of language or particular disciplinary conventions, time, the Greenwich Mean Time. All these ways of standardizing things are ways that people can make each other comprehensible, comparable, or accessible. And as one of them gains in power, or gains in the number of people that use it, it becomes more valuable for others to use the same convention. So I'll give an example of that in a moment. But I defined a network, and my book's called Network Power, as the groups that are united by the shared use of a common standard or convention. So we're all in the network of English language speakers. We're also in the network of imperial measurement standard users, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to define globalization as the rise to prominence of shared standards that underlie global networks. So as some of these standards become the most dominant means of accessing other people, they don't just stay in a local region or a single national polity, they can spread internationally, depending on a bunch of other things we're going to look at. And as these rules of the game grow, they become the rules of the game not just in one place, but in many places, which is great because we use them to gain access to other people. But it also might be a problem because these rules of the game are often not consciously chosen or signed up to. They're the results of strange and often eccentric histories that mean that one set of standards beats out other sets of standards. They arise from, as I call it, the aggregation of many decentralized individual actions, rather than through a single once and for all choice in the way that Keel had mentioned that the constitutional ratification happened. We all got together, we had a discussion about how we wanted to live together, and we had a constitutional regime. By contrast, transnational standardization, which is what I'm thinking globalization is, often happens through bit-by-bit aggregation. We're not all thinking consciously that we want to have English be the language of an international conference. It just happens to be that way. Once enough people have made their choices, our choices follow on theirs. So this brings me to my idea of network power, which is what I say is at the heart of globalization. The first idea, it consists in the joining of two ideas. The first is that coordinating standards are more valuable when more people use them. Take the English language. The reason people overseas are learning English, and that English is now by far the most widely known second language, is because people want to learn English because they know other people know English. It's not people they know who know English, it's people they don't know who they know will know English. The second thing is that this dynamic, which I describe as a form of power, it can lead to the progressive elimination of alternative standards. So do people see that picture of what's going on? Okay, so why should it matter? Sometimes it might not matter that one standard or another is chosen and becomes the kind of rules of the game. Sometimes, depending on some circumstances we can talk about, you can have multiple rules of the game at the same time, or either in the same place or in different places. But a lot of times, once there becomes a dominant rule of the game or a dominant standard, it edges out all the competitors. And sometimes those competitors are valuable to people because they represent or they somehow, they're related to important interests on the one hand. And the second case, I think that they can be related to important identities. And so you might have a concern about the rise of global standards, either from a concern about people's interests being affected or their identities being compromised in some way. And I think that a lot of the controversy about globalization comes from one of these two routes. As network power pushes global standards, people find that their interests or their identities are compromised in different ways by the rise of a dominant standard. I think this helps to explain a paradox about globalization that we've probably all noticed when we read the newspapers or read accounts of it, which is that on the one hand we see voluntary and even eager embrace of globalization. And on the other hand, we often encounter the complaint that it's coercive or even that it represents an empire. And sometimes from the very same people. So you'll see people who are denouncing globalization who are often wearing American blue jeans, speaking English, and are tied into all kinds of technologies that we think of as really the heart of globalization. How can it be, we ask ourselves, that these people are also complaining that the system they're in is somehow exerting power over them? And I think that part of our perplexity there is because when we see people choosing something, we usually think that that means that they are doing so freely. But if the story I've just told makes any sense, it might be the case that we choose the rules of the game that are going, but we might not have really had any other choice to choose. So it can be that globalization proceeds voluntarily, driven by the accretion of people's choices to learn English, or of countries, for example, to join the WTO, but that those choices may not have felt very free for people to make. So in network power, we choose in a landscape that's shaped by other people's choices, but often we find where a dominant standard is controlling in some ways an important global flow, there wasn't any other choice to choose. As Americans, we often aren't faced with that stark choice, because oftentimes the standards that are globalizing are standards that were either American by origin or American via our British forebears. But in a lot of other places, people feel very acutely that in order to gain access to other people in a newly globalized world, they have to lock into standards that are dominant that they didn't have any control over in the first place. And even while they may be very happy to do that, they may also feel ambivalent about the interests or identities that may be compromised in the process. So let me turn to some generic complaints about globalization and then suggest how we might think about remedies for the process when we think that these complaints may have some legitimacy. I think that we can divide the three ways in which people have thought globalization might be undesirable into three complaints. That it's too fast, that it's too deep, and that it's too wild. So let me say what I mean by each of these. The argument that globalization can be too fast is, as it should be clear, that even when we think that some activity can legitimately be globalized, or where we find the destination agreeable, it might be that we think nevertheless we're proceeding there too quickly. What does that mean? It means that we're proceeding too quickly for people to be able to adapt to the process in ways that leave their essential interests or their important identities uncompromised. So we might, for example, want there to be free or freer trade of different kinds, but we might disagree, and there's, I think, a legitimate disagreement here about how fast you might move toward that liberalization. So just because the destination is clear, it doesn't mean that the pace at which you want to go there should be clear. And a lot of the complaints about globalization, in the first instance, I think are of this kind. So let me give two examples, one from the rich world and one from the poorer world, to make clear how globalization could be going too fast. In the first instance, you might have seen that there's often a controversy among poorer countries about whether they should, as part of their entry into the global economy, adopt the same forms of regulation of intellectual property that the North has. So should India and China and Brazil respect American and European patents and copyrights as stringently as those intellectual properties would be protected domestically as a condition for doing trade with us? So let me break that down, because that's a little complicated. I didn't say it well. The issue is, for example, when joining the World Trade Organization or wanting to be part of a freer trading order, should the intellectual property regimes that govern one country be imposed on all? And there, I think, there's been an argument about the timing. Even if people think that it's desirable ultimately that there should be a global regulation of intellectual property, it's a question of how fast all countries need to come into conformity with it. To take an example from our own history, the United States, when it was in its period of rapid growth in the 19th century, didn't respect intellectual property. There weren't rules on this. And in fact, we borrowed and pilfered ideas from every corner we could and recombined them in all kinds of wild and wacky ways. And that helped our country to grow enormously. The same might be thought true of China today. But China today faces a different problem, which is that there are rules about intellectual property that, and there's an open question in a way that there wasn't for us in the 19th century about whether or not those property rights elsewhere need to be respected. To take an example from the rich countries, an example that I think is very close to home in this region, there's the issue of free trade in manufacturing jobs. So it might very well be that freer trade in a manufacturing sector is valuable at some time period for countries to engage in, but how fast you want to liberalize and at what cost to people in established manufacturing sectors who could be undercut by lower labor cost countries in the poor world, that's a really interesting and open question. It's not a question that the economics of the matter alone can solve. It's a political question about how fast we want globalization to proceed. The second issue, which I think is distinct from the speed of globalization, is the question of depth. Many people complain that globalization has become too deep. So if the question of globalization as being too fast is about balancing interests often of established parties against newcomers who threaten to overturn an existing distribution of, say, income in the North or the South. The worry about globalization cutting too deep is often about identity. So here you see a lot of concerns about the influence of private global actors or of new global standards on local or national identity. So the question of culture, for example, independent cinema or languages or of customs that might be being flattened. People have heard the term McWorld, like McDonaldization. So this is the concern there. It's the thought is that not that globalization is too fast in achieving a destination that we agree on, but rather the destination isn't agreed on, that maybe there are particular areas that should be left to local control. Another example is agriculture. What might seem like a technical matter, which is the extent of liberalization in agricultural goods across different countries, actually can feel like a question of identity in some countries. So one of the reasons why the Europeans often resist agricultural liberalization at the multilateral level is because the ideal of the small French farmer, for example, is very deep to the national ethos and identity of France. So it's not just an economic question, as Americans often think of it. It's a question that feels deeply linked to identity, and that itself can pose obstacles to globalization or controversies when globalization proceeds and runs over these things. And the last concern, which is distinct from these, is that globalization may be too wild. That's to say, too unregulated or unstable or ungoverned or chaotic. And here the example would be, of course, financial flows. So the global financial crisis that began with the meltdown in the American mortgage market has affected us and the Europeans. But before that, in the late 90s, 97 to 99, there was a financial crisis that engulfed a large part of the developing world. Starting in Southeast Asia, it eventually hit Brazil, all the way to Brazil and Russia, and other countries really suffered when those flows. The argument there is that the cross-border flows of money is too ungoverned, or you have all these flows of hot money that go quickly, move quickly. Entire economies can be at the mercy of kind of panic responses, and there's no global actor governing what is a global activity. So that's the argument that globalization is too wild. Now, all of these complaints have to do with our current form of globalization, which I want to describe as the rise of transnational civil society. Now, transnational meaning that's above any given country, and civil society meaning that I'm not talking in the first instance here about the UN or about international politics. I'm talking about things like economic and cultural trade, the activities of international corporations and multinational NGOs, including nonprofits. So it's not just an economic matter, but it's a question of private actors who are not part of any particular state apparatus. But it's important to realize that globalization in broader history has sometimes meant more or a different kind of form of international relation than this transnational civil society. So as one way of thinking about what we might do about globalization when it seems to threaten valuable interests or valued identities, we might want to think about what globalization is not rather than what globalization is. I want to claim that globalization is not new. Sandra already indicated that in her opening remarks. It's not uniform, it's not inevitable, and it's not free in the following senses. It's not new. Depending on how we think about cross-boundary or cross-border activity, it goes all the way back to ancient empires, the 18th century period of commerce and exploration, In the 19th century, you had an enormously free global market in many respects. And in the 20th century, the pre-war period, you had what might be called, and has often been called, the First Globalization, with the world before the First World War. So although the density of interconnections now may be new, it's a question of degree, I think, not of kind. The second issue is that globalization is not uniform. It's not monolithic or singular, because depending on what activity we're talking about, we can either have more or less of it crossing borders. And different periods of globalization have been characterized by different elements in that process. So, for example, in the so-called First Globalization, let's say between about 1870 and 1914, in a significant difference from today, you had very unrestricted flow of labor. People were moving all over the world. Many of the grandparents of people in this room might have come to this country during that period of relatively unregulated immigration. So if we think about today's globalization as being characterized by money and goods flowing easily across borders and information flowing across the internet, we're not thinking in the same way about the steamships filled with people coming to the New World and the relative absence of things like passports or border controls, even across the European continent. So the idea that we're living in a globalized world now that's unprecedented is simply untrue. In many ways, this world is a different kind of globalization where things like capital flows have taken precedence over labor flows. Third, I would say globalization is not inevitable. We should distinguish the density of cross-border contacts from the issue of whether or not they're regulated by national authorities. So if you're interested in globalization as being what do private actors do across borders, we have seen a pullback in this very century from that activity. Following the first globalization, we can characterize the mid-century period, we can call it the Keynesian period, as one in which a lot of what had been globalized during the 1870 to 1914 period became regulated within the purview of nation states. And so it wasn't that there weren't things going across borders, but governments were managing those flows. And only following the breakdown of the Bretton Woods institutions in the 1970s did we experience what we now think of as globalization. That's when it started to begin. And so we've seen a pullback from globalization already once in this century. The idea that it's inevitable is simply wrong. We'd have to disaggregate more carefully what it is that we think would be inevitable about it. And finally, globalization is not necessarily free. As I'd mentioned earlier, with the idea of network power, we can be choosing over a domain, and we're making voluntary choices, but we might think of those choices as unfree in particular dimensions, because in some ways what we're choosing is already decided by the results of other people's past choices. That's a hard philosophical issue about whether or not voluntariness and freedom are the same thing, but you see what I'm getting at. So what I think, what I think we should see coming about in globalization, a globalization that may be too fast, too deep, and too wild. How do we manage it? What can we do about it with all this in mind, especially when we realize that globalization is not new, uniform, inevitable, or free, I think we need to think about what happened in the mid-century period, and we can draw very, very valuable lessons from that. There's a usual opposition in this literature between something like globalization and the state. So the idea is that the state or the public actors are about control, and globalization is about freedom or the absence of restrictions. And I think that assumes that globalization is a question of more or less. You can either have more globalization or less globalization. Whereas what I've been arguing implicitly is that globalization is a question of kind. What kind of globalization do you want? Rather than if you want more or less of it on a single scale, the question is what kind of globalization are we having? And if we think about it in that way, I think we can have more state and more globalization. And in fact, depending on what kind of state and what kind of globalization, it might be that you have to have more of both. And that the idea that the state can simply pull away and you'll have more globalization may be a very short-run phenomena or itself unstable. And I think some of the really dramatic meltdown of the international financial order is something that, while I regret it, of course, from an intellectual perspective, it's something that my book came out just before it, and it was something that was clearly on the horizon, and I think a lot of people spotted that. Unfortunately, it sort of confirmed some of the worries I had and wanted to express when I first wrote that book. So if we think about a situation in which we can have more state and more globalization of a different kind, we might want, as I said, to look back to the history of the 20th century itself. And there we can detect what we might call a double wave of globalization. That in the early period, you have something that, in many respects, leaving aside labor, is a very globally integrated world without a lot of state control over cross-border flows. Following the period of the wars, up to the breakdown of the Bretton Woods, in the mid-70s, you have a much more regulated world. It's not for that reason autarkic or anti-international, but it's a world in which there's strong global governance managing what globalization there is. And then following the breakdown of Bretton Woods, there's been a resurgence of a form of globalization which is more driven by and responsive to private actors wanting to cross borders outside the discretion of the nation states on either side of the receiving country or the sending country. So if we think that this latest phase, which is what we properly have been calling globalization, has some problems, what should we do about it? And I've said that we need some kind of reassertion of state authority over the matter. But state authority can take many different forms. Let me distinguish three possible ways. The first is that we could simply withdraw from some aspect of globalization, right? We think that globalization is too wild, let's say, with capital flows that move quickly and unconstrainedly across national borders in ways that destabilize domestic economies. Well, in response to that, many countries have asserted capital controls to make sure that that process is regulated. That's the state partly withdrawing from globalization, at least globalization understood as an unregulated process. The second issue is that we're familiar with the states managing global flows of something, for example, migration. There's the international migration regime is not multilateralized to any significant extent, but it's something that states deal with themselves and are used to handling. And there's a diversity of ways that different states deal with the problem. But there might be lessons from that area for how the states could manage global flows elsewhere, not just in people, but in things like money or goods. And finally, there's the construction of a different kind of globalization through different forms of global governance. And that we're familiar with explicitly international constructions of states through things like international treaties, and also just coordination of administrative regimes, safe transportation regimes, or the treaties and administrative regimes governing airports, right? We take for granted that we can fly between two countries. It's actually quite a complicated legal act that has been sorted out. And it's not that we privately do so, I decide I want to fly to France. It's actually that I'm taking advantage of an international legal regime which allows me to do that. So in some ways, I think the proper question to be asking is not globalization more or less, but globalization as a privatized phenomenon or as a phenomenon governed by international law and global governance. So this is maybe a bit of an unfashionable thing to claim, to say that we need to bring the state back in. Because what's been exciting in discussions of globalization in the last, say, 20 years has been to claim there's something dramatically new that undermines the role of the state. There are new network technologies in the digital age. There's new forms of non-state terrorism that cross borders in dramatic ways. There are global epidemics and so on. All of this is true, but none of it means that there's an obvious solution to them outside the old one of bringing public authority to bear on these problems. Even critics of globalization haven't, though, wanted to turn to the state. For the most part, what you have in the anti-globalization movement are people who think that we should reshape globalization through the beneficent rather than the corrupt activities of private actors, in this case NGOs, community agents, and so on, which seems to me like more networks to counter networks. And there may be a role for that, but the idea that ordinary politics won't have a role to play seems to me implausible. Now, I say global governance as distinct from global government, and global government is an issue that came up in the question and answer with Akil, and maybe that's something we can take up in the question and answer. I don't know about global government. I haven't thought about it much, but I think global governance of a kind that takes politics seriously and takes government seriously is really essential. And what form that would eventually take is something that I need to think more about, but maybe we could think about it together. At least in terms of the global governance issue that I'm thinking about, what it would look like in significant respects is this mid-century period. Now, it'll be different than that period, because the idea that we're just going to return to the 1950s with government agents on different sides, is implausible along a few different axes. The first is that re-regulation of the global sphere will involve a much larger range of countries than it did then. There are just a lot more countries in the world now. It might have been easier to pull off a highly internationally controlled world before the many colonial countries gained independence. So that's just an issue we're going to have to think about, which is that the post-colonial countries are going to have to be involved in the process in a way that wasn't true when this earlier period of Keynesian regulation happened. The second issue is that I think we're going to have to take much more seriously than we had to then the issue of democratic legitimation, or the democracy deficit. It's true, I think, that the European Union has a real democracy deficit, but so far it seems that those sorts of relatively democratically challenged federative forms are the ones that are usually counterposed to transnational private life. We have to find something else that's not a regulated but undemocratic sphere of globalization, nor an unregulated sphere of globalization. We have to find a way to combine global regulation and democratic legitimacy. And finally, I think, unlike the earlier Keynesian regime, we don't have to make this stuff up anew. There's a huge number of multilateral institutions and fora that are already there that have been largely stripped down since the 70s or have lost their purpose. We don't have to make them up from scratch. We just have to renew them and reinvigorate their public purposes. That's something I can talk about at greater length later. What kind of time do I have? I don't want to go on. Maybe I should wrap up pretty soon.
Well, 10
What?
more minutes.
Great, super. Okay, that's super. Well, I'll close with thinking about this idea that we need to reassert some state power in response to globalization gone awry, because I don't want to pretend that it isn't without its problems too. There have been two persistent responses or fantasies when we think about the relation of domestic politics to the foundations of global order. The first is something like that we should construct a world-spanning Leviathan, and that's the global government question. And that's not on the agenda, or anybody's agenda right now, so I'm going to put it to one side for the moment, but we can pick it up again, as I said. The second issue is that we can do without the politics of the state system altogether in the global sphere, and that we can just rely on the transnational networks of private agents. And I think that's a problem. I think that's also a fantasy. It's as much a fantasy in some ways as a single world state. And I kind of wrote my network power book to challenge it, or to raise questions about it. But there is a problem, and I think that's why these two responses keep coming up. And the problem is that the reassertion of sovereign power over globalization often comes in a way that undermines democratic politics. The most obvious route for the reassertion of state power right now to deal with global problems is through top-down responses by experts who are dealing with exceptional or emergency responses. We've seen this in the rise of the national security state. But it's not just a security problem. We've seen it in how the current administration and the administration before it has dealt with the financial crisis, which is largely to privilege closed-door sessions of experts, oftentimes experts who seem somehow linked to the people who caused the problem. And so it's not a right-left thing. Bush and Obama have both tended to have top-down emergency crisis styles of leadership, and Democrats, Republicans alike. It's not only a security issue. It's a rather deep problem with getting democratic state action, which is that when you say that the state is necessary for something, then you have to immediately face the fact that state action can be corrupt and dangerous. And I don't want to dodge that one. That's just a problem with the response I've offered. But what I don't think is a proper response is the thought that we can just do without the state altogether. We have to deal with it. And on that note, I thought I might read a paragraph rather than trying to resuscitate it from my memory, a paragraph of a piece I just wrote at the end, and then I'll close with that, which is that when we reflect on what the return of the state often entails in practice, it's not hard to understand why an ideology of transnational civil society keeps recurring in our thinking about globalization. It's not simply a convenient argument for those poised to make money in newly deregulated markets. It's also that if we were able to construct our shared global life without requiring recourse to politics, we could avoid the messy, imperfect, and uphill struggle for the sort of politics we want to have. Unsurprisingly, then, the fantasy that we can find freedom outside of, rather than through, politics is particularly persistent when we think about the global order. But we've cherished this illusion not once in this century, but twice, and neither time with happy consequences. So I think that the task of building a system of international governance for our era of globalization gone awry remains before us still. Thank you very much. Questions or thoughts or comments or criticisms?
Can you give us some examples of governance, global governance? Are you, or they are failed when once you consider failing things like the UN?
Well, that's a hard one, but yeah. So, well, I'll take a specific example, which would be, say, the World Trade Organization, which is in some ways a successful example of global governance because the treaty organization is very vibrant, commands the almost all the major countries in the world are parties to it. But so that's the one area where global governance, you would say, against my argument, has proceeded apace in recent years. In fact, the trading regime has been strengthened, if anything, in the emergence of the WTO from the GATT, remember the GATT. On the other hand, the way that it's been strengthened is precisely to get government interference out by creating standardized rules that allow private parties to have more of a say over trade. So in some ways, the only examples I can find where global governance has been strengthened in recent years is in part in precisely in keeping government out. So governments have in some ways conspired to keep themselves out. So, and this is responsive to the argument that what public authorities need to do is to tie their own hands because they can't be trusted and to leave private actors to deliver the goods. Now, suppose we don't think either that those private actors are delivering the goods or that the goods that they're delivering are the kind we want. Then we might want not to ditch something like the World Trade Organization, but to redirect it. So along those lines, there have been a couple proposals that have been made that would tie free trade liberalization to things like having strong standards for labor rights or human rights or environmental protection. So the argument would be that you don't necessarily get to have unrestricted access to another country's economy if you're not abiding by rules and regulations that we think should be multilateralized. So I think that I think one way of answering your question would be that global governance can often fail, but some of the ways in which we've seen it succeed may be precisely where governments are tying their hands. But there may be ways that we can still have a set of multilateral rules that don't require government discretion, but that are responsive to some of our values that we don't think that the current system is answering. So, for example, things like bringing human rights into the conversation. Exactly. Exactly. Equality is a hard one, but getting things like labor, absolutely. Yeah, I'm for equality, but yeah. So, other thoughts?
What about the situation with the globalization of the drug trade?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a classic example.
It's very interesting.
There is no international organization that can deal with that.
Right. I mean, to some extent, you'd have to have coordinated enforcement operations, which you do have, but oftentimes they don't work very well. But I think the issue you're raising is that globalization has helped many different private actors, including criminal ones. So the issue is, if it's easier to get things across borders and there isn't much scrutiny, and there are new technologies that make it easier, and people can call a cell phone from the jungle in Colombia and check on a delivery in Miami, that's true whether you're sending cocoa or cocaine. And a new world. I mean, obviously one of them is illegal, and we'd hope that it could be they could be got. But that's true of human trafficking and a huge number of other issues. I mean, when I said that there isn't a massive flow of labor now across borders, I meant legal. In fact, there's huge numbers of people being trafficked now all over the world. And in response to that, we need multilateral efforts. So we need more, in a sense, globalization to deal with the bad globalization. But as I was trying to suggest, what kind do we need? We need a globalization that is responsive to public authorities, that has public enforcement capabilities, that isn't just more private action. So So you might let's take something like the drug trade. You might say that's a bad kind of globalization where private actors are doing something wrong. Is the response then to say rely on private civil society to deal with the problem, or would the requirement be some kind of public action across different countries that are agreeing on some kind of enforcement regime? And I'm arguing that too much of the attention has been on the former, and that we should really try and reinvigorate the latter. I think the drug trade is, against what I just said, one of the few cases where there actually is a lot of interest in getting enforcement because it's something that is a hot button issue. But something like human trafficking, it's not getting the headlines in the way that it should, unlike cocaine from Latin America. Yeah. Yeah. Should you grab them or I grab them? Or? Yeah, you grab them. Okay.
No, I was putting it-
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah.
So, how about legal immigration? You talked about how it's a free capital today, but not free
Yeah.
movement of labor.
Yeah.
That's not what the world was like in 1910. That's not what
Yep.
America was like. And in particular, America's role in this larger question about the free mobility of persons.
Mm-hmm.
And how does all of this connect up with increased democratization? One argument might be, it's easier to have free flows of human beings as long as they don't vote or anything, because
Right.
they can just, but actually they need to be assimilated into democratic cultures. So anyway, those are the issues.
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. So
Nice, easy question.
yeah, it's a hard question. I would say that that at the very least, the thought that capital should be free while labor imprisoned within the bounds of the nation state, that extreme divergence is clearly wrong. And I would probably think that capital and labor should gain freedom together in degrees. So the thought that if we're going to be able to ship factories elsewhere, ship money elsewhere, but not have people come here to do work that we then cite elsewhere, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And the thought is that you'd have, in some ways, perhaps even tie openness to new labor flows and openness to capital together. Now, just like too unregulated a flow of new labor into a country can destabilize existing regimes, including democratic governance, the same is true of unrestricted capital flows. So it's been, the East Asian crisis, the Southeast Asian crisis in the late 90s overturned some regimes. Now, that was actually a victory for democracy as it was, but the point is that you can get great instability from unrestricted capital flows as well as labor flows. On the labor flow issue, I would say it's probably too fast. It's a speed question, I would say. So the question would be to dose your liberalization of labor with the question of the maintenance of core domestic commitments being the constraint that you put on that. That should be the brake, not a brake that comes from fear of other people, exactly. And I think that it's perfectly legitimate. So some people would say there are some very strong proponents of take down the borders, let people flow again. And I could see the reasoning for that. I think the only concern in that would be something like what Professor Amar mentioned, which is what that will do to domestic regimes. Now, what that will do to domestic regimes in two senses. First, in a country like the United States, where we don't have a very strong welfare state compared to, say, Northern Europe, I think that there is a separate set of concerns than in Northern Europe, where the issue of whether or not the outsiders will undermine the ability of the welfare state to finance itself raises a whole separate set of questions. I've seen some research that set of questions is actually overblown, and that actually precisely what some of these countries need is new entrants to the workforce. How to tie workforce participation to social benefits is a complicated question. The Europeans are struggling with that. But here in this country, we don't have that concern. The issue would be rather the question of new immigrants changing the wage level, basically. But on that issue, I think there's a parallelism between new immigrants coming in and lowering wages and capital threatening or either threatening to move or moving elsewhere and lowering the wage level. So there's an exact parallelism there, and that's why I said that probably capital and labor should gain freedom together in degrees with the constraint or the brakes being applied on the speed with which that happens, concerns about the integrity of a domestic community. I don't know, that's the best I can do. I think it's a hard one. There's no easy answer there, but I think that the answer that we currently have is clearly not the right answer, which is unrestricted capital flows and very strong restrictions on labor. Yeah.
The whole topic is so difficult for me to understand. It's huge. It seems like if true globalization is ever going to happen, this vast difference in wealth has to start evening out. And that seems to be the biggest problem as far as the social upheavals that will happen. I mean, obviously, we can't have equality with countries that are living in a third or fourth world compared to us. And I think that's where I see the whole thing breaking down.
Yeah.
Well, that's part of the American pain, part of what we're going through, because that's starting to happen.
Yes.
Because our standard of living is going down. It has to go
It
down.
has to. But how does that happen without revolution? Without,
That is a really hard issue. I have struggled with those issues myself. Did people want to get on this point? Did you want to get on this point itself?
Well, and then
Seems
to
like
take that a step further, if that's the case, then are we really staying capitalist or are we then socializing?
I don't know.
You know?
So you think that's a big part of the ongoing debate?
Yes, exactly. And at every level of our lifestyle, because from medical care to everything.
Mm-hmm. I would say that's probably a too fast or fast enough question in part. So it's absolutely true that there are places with living standards that are literally a tenth or whatever of the U.S. wage rate, say, and that are our major trade partners. But then the issue would be, how can we engage with those countries in ways that are mutually beneficial without radically undermining our domestic community in some way? And I think one thing we should do, I think, which is important, and this is just a sort of a philosophical issue, it's been common in these discussions to bundle trade and charity. And I think we probably shouldn't. So you might say that we owe more to a country that is truly fourth world, in which people are not able to meet a very basic minimum. But what we owe them may or may not be commerce. It may be aid. And if you take that, but what's been common in economics is to assume that there's an invisible hand that makes private benefit transmute into, private selfishness transmute into collective benefit. This goes back to Adam Smith. And in fact, maybe that's not so, or maybe it should be the case that a country that is relatively rich, or in which people are meeting their basic needs, we have less need to worry about that country and than a country where people aren't meeting basic needs. But then again, how we meet basic needs, it may be that some of the very poorest countries in the world don't need our trade as much as our aid, at least for now. And the question of trade seems to me to be a question that is more tightly linked, for example, between the U.S. and major continental powers like China or India. Those are countries, and those countries are not situations like in sub-Saharan Africa where people are struggling to meet very basic minimums.
Aren't you still supposing that nation states like ours would be that altruistic to think about what other people need? I mean, if we're a democracy and we have free trade and we have capitalism, how is a capitalist supposed to look at that and say, okay, these people need my help? That doesn't happen.
I think that is true, and so we have to make sure that it's not only capitalists who stand to make money in global markets who are deciding about the extent of our engagement in them. And so that's where I think, you're pushing me toward the political question, and I won't shy away from it. I think the reason that since the breakdown of the Bretton Woods in the 70s, we've had this globalization that seems to be all about economics and not about other things, is because we haven't exercised democratic oversight over powerful private actors who stand to make money overseas. And I think that part of the reason why the reassertion of the state, which we're going to need for reasons of ordinary control over making things stable enough that we can have normal lives, one aspect of the reassertion of the state we have to make sure is that it's not then just the same experts in a different guise who are running the show, but that we actually use it as an opening up to get more democratic control over the process. And then I think I have enough faith in the American people that different sets of values will come into play. It won't just be all charity all the way down, but it may be much more balanced.
But isn't that, going back to your presentation,
Yeah.
isn't that unlikely, where you said that one of the notions that we have that you were attempting to dispel is inevitability.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that because of international enterprise and internet communication and even nationalization, as you discussed, of the English language, that it is inevitable. And
Mm-hmm.
that to call upon sovereign forces to intervene
Mm-hmm.
to treat other kinds of problems other than the enterprise notion is not really available.
Mm-hmm. So I think that there may be some aspects of globalization that are more or less inevitable. But I want to resist the idea that all of them are. So if we were living in 1910, where the whole world was on a global monetary standard, the gold standard, the argument that we might end up having a very strange world in which we're all using paper currencies controlled by national governments, not by transnational economy, would have been very strange. Yet we were there within a few decades because we had to be. In the case, the reason for that is that the gold standard didn't allow a proper balance between the ease of transnational flows and the need for national autonomy over a set of important areas like domestic economic control. So it was in response to that we had this Keynesian mid-century moment. And what I'm suggesting is that we can learn something from that. If you go back and read John Maynard Keynes's famous work on the economic consequences of the peace, he starts it with this description that maybe I should have read. I was thinking about it. That could sound like us today. He's talking about, and this is like 1910, he's talking about sitting, reading his newspaper, sipping his tea, looking at the international markets. All the products in his kitchen are from everywhere in the world. A completely globalized form of life. And in response to that, I think what he himself and a bunch of people like him tried to do was to create a world in which you could still have a lot of international flow, but it wouldn't be so wild or so deep or so fast. And I think that we're kind of stuck with the same situation. Now, the big difference there would be something like the internet, you might say. The internet's not going to go away. And that's true. Neither did the steamship or the railroad. But it doesn't mean that in the mid-century, these technologies necessarily meant that you couldn't have public authority intervene where it was necessary. We find that's the hope. If it is inevitable, though, then we have to think about second-best options. I haven't thought about this much, but... Yeah.
The globalization of environmental
Yeah.
issues that so often are emanating from national policies, be it Brazil or China or wherever.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any hopes on the horizon for dealing with those issues on a global, global issues?
Yeah. You got to. I mean, you have to hope so.
Have to be dealt with.
Yeah. I think our fourth speaker. I don't want to. I think our fourth speaker is she here? I think she's going to deal with that issue a lot. But just two points of note on that. One is that you may have seen it with Brazil. I guess you're thinking about rainforest destruction, and there was that proposal to get international funds from rich countries to pay for Brazil to keep forests in place as part of carbon storage. And I think that financial transfer mechanism is the kind of thing that I'm thinking that we have to try and work on. That's global governance. That's not private actors exactly. That's public authorities trying to deal with a problem that is global. Whether or not we can make it work is a different matter, and whether that's the right solution, I don't know. But I'm given hope by the fact that there are so many efforts of this kind. And then the problem is that they seem not to often have enough force behind them. And I don't know how to think about that. But, I mean, Sandra, you mentioned the UN and so on. And the UN has a lot of agencies that deal with problems and have those problems as their official sort of, it's in their portfolio. And exactly why they haven't been able to do more is something that is curious. But I think that that's the form of the solution. Whether we just have to put more strength behind them or not is something else. But as for China and the environmental issues there, we have to hope that there's at least the other thing we have to hope is that there's responsiveness. The global issue is going to create local problems too. So all of my friends who've been to China have mentioned that the cities are utterly choked. So the pollution that is a global problem is not just a global problem, it's also a local problem. So part of the solution there has to come through more local participation and control over activities. And whether that means the democratization of China or some other form of popular control over the issue, I think that's going to have to be part of the problem. And you wonder whether a democratic China would have the same problems as this form of China. I don't know. It's getting into controversial areas. Yeah.
It seems to me also that the non-governmental organizations have played a very vital role in this development.
Yes.
When you look at the enormous, each one of us, I'm sure, gets requests from organizations, and when we look at the amount of work that they're doing, and also the move to make sure that they're working with communities and hiring people who are from those communities has made a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So my remarks that were skeptical of private beneficent action are not meant to be totally skeptical, but to direct our attention to the way in which some of those movements should be aiming at public legislation. Yes. So it seems to me like part of the goal at the end of the prize for NGO mobilization is to change public norms in a way that will eventually change law. Not just that we continue to have the good guys doing good things, unable to ever stop the bad guys from doing bad things. So, and the worry I have about, say, the people who thought that the way we should handle a globalization gone awry is through a new form of ethical globalization, is that unless that runs at some level through the state, you never get an enforcement mechanism. And so you can often just have bad actors who shift their location of something. That's the worry I have. But absolutely, I think for mobilization of consciousness and for support for things, these movements are essential. Yeah. Yeah.
I can't imagine any of what we're striving for without a state, because without states, without laws. And who has laws and who makes and changes laws? People, citizens of states.
Yeah.
So and then I can see the flaws in the United Nations, but I would like to envision a better version of that kind of organization that is not governing, but an example of governance.
Governance, yeah.
So it's hard for me to, and the other, just one thing I would take issue with you said about charity, and that some states may be better to get aid than to get
trade.
Other kinds of help.
Yeah.
Well,
or need it more, I would say.
Aid is a dirty word in so many conferences that I go to, international conferences of NGOs, because they find that the price they pay for taking it is too great for their culture or their economy. And building capacity is what some body should be doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when I meant aid, I should have said that could include things like capacity building of various kinds. I meant to say that the argument that we just open up borders and countries will of themselves come out of desperate situations through the magic of the market, that seems to me naive. But the precise way in which should help other countries is very, very complicated. It must be very context dependent. So in some cases you do, I think, want to give food, and the Horn of Africa is. But in other cases you need there to be policy reforms of various deep kinds before that food will even reach people. And that's the problem right now, as I understand it, in the Horn of Africa. So, no, good. That's an excellent point. As for the UN thing, I don't know. I agree with you that some thinking like that is important. I know Akil was edging toward that too in his stuff. But how to do it? Do you have thoughts on that in your last chapter, on how we actually how?
Not out of chapter.
Yeah. Well, he's my senior colleague, so I'm looking to him for some.
Not so much. I did have a different question.
Oh, okay. You see what I get? Yes. Yeah.
Well, since we are connecting it up to current events to some extent, since you did on a couple of occasions mention the Keynesian moment, could you give us a 3-minute discussion of the gold standard and Ron Paul's what Paul's suggestion would actually be?
No, I don't. He wants to remonetize it, right? I looked into this a little, but I know that a proposal to remonetize gold was on the Republican platform in Texas, the state party in the Texas branch. It was part of its proposal for the country for a long time. So this has actually been, in some circles, I gather, going on for a long time. my best understanding of it is that it goes back to the immediate post-war critics of Keynesianism, including two very prominent conservatives who people probably heard of, Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. And both of them were strong proponents.
Michelle Bachmann has been big on this.
They have been. Okay.
She invokes von Mises.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right.
She's read him.
Interesting. Well, this. So both these economists were very concerned about the extent of state intervention, and what they thought was that the move off the gold standard to paper currency allowed for Keynesian monetary policy of various ways, but also the Keynesian monetary policy would invite broader, deeper intervention by the state into the economy. And they were very strong advocates of private economic liberty. And so you can see how the argument would go. If the state can control the money supply, it can, for example, as was, I think, Keynes in the end of his general treatise, suggests that the goal of state control of the money supply should be to maintain something like full employment. And that something like that, maintaining full employment, would slowly reduce the returns to capital, and you would shift the share of income that capitalists got in favor of working people. And that was a kind of, it's a minor note in what is a very long examination, a general theory, but that's there. And I think that von Mises and Hayek picked that up and were worried about that. And the easiest way to knock out that state role, I think they thought, was to go back to gold. It wasn't that long ago when they were writing that actually the world had been governed by gold. And what would happen if you were governed by gold? You couldn't have extensive state borrowing in order to do Keynesian counter-cyclical spending. It's not just a question of monetary policy, it's also a question of fiscal policy. So if you don't want the state borrowing to fund things, you have to make sure that literally the money's in the bank if it's gold. You can't have an extensive system of credit. But on the other hand, I think it's kind of inevitable that at a moment when there's a lot of question about the extent of the U.S. debt, how we're going to pay it back, worry about powerful financial interests that may be manipulating things behind the scenes, all of that kind of stuff. It's a very natural thought that people will run back for gold because it's the last monetary convention that we had before this current order, and so as the current order seems to be, sort of withstanding some serious pressures, but buckling a little, people want to go back to gold. I should clarify that people remember how this worked. At one point, gold was money, and then paper currency was fixed to gold, and then in the post-war period, paper currencies were fixed to the U.S. dollar, which was itself fixed to gold, and then in 71, Nixon unilaterally took the United States off the gold-dollar link, and then the currency began to float freely, and I think that that's the moment where something like our current globalization, we can think of it beginning then, in part, because then there was no more regulation on the money, and the currencies went against each other. So going back to gold, I don't know what they mean. If what they mean is going back to, gold coins, that's one thing. If what they mean is fixing the dollar to some supply of gold, and then, yeah, so that's a different thing. And then the question would be, well, why not have a globally coordinated currency negotiation of the kind that you had in the Bretton Woods? And then why have gold at all? If what they're worried about is actually currencies and hot money, I'm concerned about that too. I might have a different solution than anchoring the dollar to gold. I might think that we need more coordination among paper monies.
I just can't remember if you were talking about it, but it's an example of a certain kind of focal point in a certain way. For instance, somewhat arbitrary in the
gold.
Grand Central Station.
Absolutely.
I was wondering if you actually had ever really done a
Yeah.
It connects several of your interests, if you've
Absolutely.
actually sort of written about gold.
I have. So in the book, which I think Sandra has on sale, they're on sale. Yes. Oh, I see. Oh, he's such a good senior colleague that he's giving me my, yeah. Yes. So the first I actually use gold as an example of the first globalization because it's a focal point, just as Akil was saying. And it was a global monetary convention, and it was transnational. And the issue of why it didn't work was that it didn't allow individual countries autonomy over things like fiscal and monetary policy. And so if you want some local discretion over that activity, you don't want to be too tightly bundled to global money like gold. You need some local control. And so I think that gold is a really potent example. And it's surprising, though, to me that at a moment when in fact it's partly globalization gone awry that's leading to the crisis, people would be going for an earlier form of globalization. It's actually doesn't make a lot of sense for these figures. They should probably be arguing for something more like keeping our own money but repudiating international commitments, rather than getting us involved in what would then be a tremendously constraining international commitment. But I think that, again, the genealogy there is to some prominent conservative thinkers who they may be partly reading or reading Wikipedia on. Yeah.
On the issue of climate change, could you give us some global pointers which would take sufficient regard for the historic inequities between developed and developing countries?
To be honest, I just can't. That is such a complicated issue. I know that there are people who work on that all the time, and is that what Catherine's? I think our next speaker is that, so that might be a very good way for me to wiggle out of it. But this sounds like something that you might work on yourself. Am I getting that?
Are there any other questions? Oh,
I
Gina.
just wanted to make a remark that
Sure.
the golden rule,
Yeah.
he who owns the gold makes the rules.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the way it works.
Yes, that's right. We went from the golden rule, number 1, which I could agree to the golden rule number 2, which I'm worried about, and I don't want to go back there. So thank you very much.
Is Katie here? Well, she will be on her way. So you